I swear to submit to the following set of rules drawn up and confirmed by Dogma 95. Shooting must be done on location. Props and sets must not be brought in. If a particular prop is necessary for the story, a location must be chosen where this prop is to be found.
2. The sound must never be produced apart from the images, or vice versa. Music must not be used unless it occurs where the scene is being shot.
3. The camera must be handheld. Any movement or immobility attainable in the hand is permitted. The film must not take place where the camera is standing. Shooting must take place where the film takes place.
4. The film must be in color. Special lighting is not acceptable. If there is too little light for exposure, the scene must be cut or a single lamp be attached to the camera.
5. Optical work and filters are forbidden.
6. The film must not contain superficial action. Murders, weapons, etc. must not occur.
7. Temporal and geographical alienation are forbidden. That is to say that the film takes place here and now.
8. Genre movies are not acceptable.
9. The film format must be Academy 35mm.
10. The director must not be credited.
Furthermore, I swear as a director to refrain from personal taste. I am no longer an artist. I swear to do so by all the means available and at the cost of any good taste and any aesthetic considerations. Thus I make my vow of chastity.
Hello, and welcome to Cannesversations. I'm Eliana.
And I'm Patrick. Hi.
And we are going to be doing episode 7. Last week, we decided that we would talk about the film, the Thomas Vinterberg 1998 film, Festen.
Your pick.
My pick, also called The Celebration.
Only in the US, I think, right?
Yes, that is correct. Festen was the inaugural film of the Dogma 95 movement, and it aimed to reframe the entire filmmaking industry. So, very big ambitions. But before we get into that, we wanted to discuss a letter written by filmmaker Lisandro Alonso to Thierry Frémaux that recently found itself in the newest edition of the CinemaScope. We thought we'd read it out loud. Dear Thierry Frémaux, I hope this letter finds you amidst a rare moment of clarity, for it is high time that someone shed light on the festering hypocrisy that engulfs the Cannes Film Festival. I write to you today with a heavy heart consumed by the unyielding anger and frustration that stems from the blatant favoritism and insidious tactics employed by your organization. I write this open letter with profound frustration and disappointment over the programming decisions made for this year's Cannes. As a filmmaker who has poured my heart and soul into creating thought-provoking and artistically daring works, I cannot help but express my vehement opposition to the relegation of my film, Eureka, to the Cannes Premiere section. It is no secret that Cannes Premiere was previously reserved for films aimed at a popular audience, a platform for commercially viable movies. Last year's inclusion of more popular films was understandable, given the unprecedented circumstances surrounding the pandemic. However, this year's lineup appears to serve a different purpose altogether, to block films from other festivals, regardless of their artistic merit. Eureka is a film that pushes the boundaries of storytelling, challenging conventional narratives and delving into complex philosophical themes. Its exclusion from the competition not only undermines the artistic integrity of the film, but also sends a disheartening message to filmmakers who strive to create cinema that transcends the mundane. By relegating Eureka to Cannes Premiere, you effectively devalue its artistic significance and limit its exposure to a discerning and appreciative audience. This decision is a blatant insult to the countless hours of dedication and artistry poured into its creation. It is a betrayal of the very essence of cinema. Similarly, Victor Héris's Close Your Eyes is a work of profound beauty and emotional resonance. Héris is a masterful filmmaker whose artistry has captivated audiences around the world. It is an insult to his immense talent and the legacy of his previous works to confine Close Your Eyes to a section that seems more concerned with appeasing commercial interests than celebrating true cinematic achievements. By using Cannes Premiere as a means to block films from other festivals, you are hindering the progress of cinema as an art form. Cannes has long been regarded as a platform for artistic innovation and discovery, a place where groundbreaking films and visionary directors find their audience. To betray this legacy in favor of protecting territorial interests is a disservice to filmmakers and the audience alike. Yours sincerely, Lisandro Alonso.
So, Eliana, having just voiced that strong opinion of Alonso, what did you think about that when you read that first?
Well, I think that he was definitely very upset, and probably rightfully so. We both saw his film, Eureka, at Cannes, and it was to our liking. I think of this letter as a warning, in a way, to filmmakers in the industry now, and a call for the prestigious film festival to perhaps rethink their programming, because they don't want to lose filmmakers who just show interest in being at Cannes. There seems to be a great disparity between their representation, or the perceived representation, and I guess respect that the filmmakers have, and the commercialized avenues that the film festival also takes.
Yeah, and we will see how consequential this really will play out, right? Because on the one hand, there is Alonso criticizing this, and I also think rightly so. I think one can make the strong case that this Cannes premiere section that doesn't really have a strong focus when you compare it, especially to other festivals like in Berlin, where you have clear sections like the Panorama and the Forum sections for once. And with Cannes, it seems really, as he says, take as many known and established filmmakers as possible and somehow fit them into the festival. And then you have films that are consensually deemed not very good, but they are in competition. And we all know that there are reasons for that are rather personal than merited.
Of course, a highly subjective topic in general, but definitely interesting to see how, if at all, the festival might go forward. I don't know if Thierry Frémaux will ever address this.
And I think this is actually a welcome moment for us to bet. I'm a fan of betting. Do you think Thierry Frémaux will ever address this letter?
I think that there are probably, and you won't like the way that I answer this, I think there probably could be changes in the programming. I don't even know.
So an indirect response.
This is an indirect response, yes. How I think that he will address it, yeah.
I see. Well, that would make it to the better, no?
Yeah, perhaps another prize will be invented. I don't know.
Another section for Nanni Moretti and Sean Penn.
Oh my.
Well, anyway, so this is our little digression here, and we go back to our film of the day, and I think this will give us opportunity enough to talk for hours possibly, but we won't go thus far. But yeah, so Festen, Eliana, I think it's impossible to discuss this film without talking a bit about the dogma movement itself.
Absolutely impossible. In 1995, March, Paris. Should be in a different order, but you get what I mean.
What happened back then?
Let's see. We're in the Odeon. We're in Paris. And we have the 100th anniversary of the Lumière brothers' first film and screening.
Basically just the 100th anniversary of cinema.
Exactly. I mean, it's debatable, I suppose, whether they were the first of the firsts. However, of course, it's their film. We're in Paris. Everyone's happy. Everyone's wondering whether cinema will be alive for the upcoming 100 years. And Lars von Trier and Thomas Vinterberg, along with two other Danish filmmakers at the time,
Søren Kragh Jacobsen and Christian Levering,
took it upon themselves, allegedly 1 week before, to write a set of rules which have now become the vow of chastity that we recited earlier together, in order to aim towards getting a purer version of cinema. They were very disillusioned with the fact that cinema was aiming to deceive, aiming to fool people, was not something that was easily accessible to filmmakers, aspiring filmmakers, and they were not happy with the way that aesthetics had...
How they had really established, right? And how they had sort of forcing frame on their work. And it's quite interesting to see how, there's this documentary that we both watched by Jesper Jagel in 2003, where the four main figures of the movement looked back at their first works. And Lars von Trier in particular, he seems he always seems to be the one that is most concerned with the theory of it all. You know, he wants to conceptualize filmmaking, and you can feel that he basically lives cinema, and he thinks about it 24/7. And he says that for him, a very important aspect of the movement was to lose control. Because as a director, I mean, it seems so intuitive, right? You have all the control. You can control the camera. You can control the actors. You control everything. You control the editing later as well. And this is really, that's a counterintuitive thing to me. And I guess there's also this idea, right, in cinema that in terms of form, you always look for a new form. And once you find it, and if it is just repeated enough and enough, it becomes the new standard. And then it doesn't have this effect on you anymore. And I think you can really only think these periods as periods. You know, there is not this one movement that then lets evaporate all the others. No, there is a continuity, there's a flow, a fluctuation, and it only lasts for so long.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe, people, when they write about Dogma 95, they talk about the fact that it was highly inspired by the French New Wave. They call Dogma 95 essentially the Danish Nouvelle Vague. We also have the idea of digital filmmaking that was sort of born out of this, even though one of the rules that we recited earlier was that it should be the Academy standard of 35 millimeters. This is somewhat confusing because then we have the first Dogma film, Festen, being on a...
it's on a
Sony,
relatively cheap Sony camcorder, I think. And we have behind the scenes footage where we can see how small this camera really is.
Yeah, it's extremely small. And I do think that the 35 millimeters was not to reference being on celluloid film, but rather about the aspect ratio. So nowadays, the aspect ratio of a film might be 3:2, not necessarily, or even larger, but then it was 4:3 aspect ratio, which was the old Academy 35 millimeter version.
But I really think it was also about capturing, on film what happened, because the words that you will always find when you look up Dogma is unveiling the truth, right? Unveiling the truth of the characters, unveiling the truth of the story. And of course, when you capture something really on film, that is different to digital. But at the same time, as you pointed out, and I think rightfully so, this was a time of huge transition for the entire industry. The 90s really marked the development or the progress more and more from analog filmmaking to digital filmmaking. And Festen is actually, in that respect, it's not only when it comes to Dogma 95, it's also when it comes to digital filmmaking. It's really incisive, the turning point in that respect. I looked it up online, and only a few months before the film started in Cannes in 1998, there was this American horror film that no one remembers anymore these days. It's called The Last Broadcast by Stefan Avalos and Lance Whaler. And that premiered at a local theater in Pennsylvania. Yeah, I don't know if I've heard of that place before. Back then, it was not at all a thing to play a digital film. So what they did was they had satellite streaming in order to show that film. But that also shows you this was the first film that was entirely shot and edited on consumer level digital equipment. And this was only a few months before Festen. And of course, Festen was much more commercially successful and became really phenomenon, especially so through the Dogma movement, that Thomas Vinterberg was really early there.
It wasn't even until around 2013 that it was a norm that movie theaters had converted to a digital standard of projection. I believe over 90% of movie theaters in the United States, at least, were running digitally, which is crazy when we think about how film and analog filmmaking had just been transitioned out virtually and put on the back burner.
The rules of Dogma was a game. It was an ideology, it was politics, It was a provocation, it was arrogance, but it was also playfulness.
Maybe we should also just say that the same year in Cannes, there was also The Idiots by Lars von Trier. And I think we were not really able to figure out why Festen is really number one and not The Idiots, because it was also, at the beginning, it was just Lars von Trier and Thomas Vinterberg. Mm-hmm. Those two, as you said, I think in like 30 minutes or so, they came up with the vow of chastity and this entire set of rules. And if anyone, it was Lars von Trier, because he was on that panel in Paris in 1995. And one would expect him to be the first one to be cited as having produced a dogma film, especially, you know, it's the same Cannes. But
perhaps, yeah, he had just finished Breaking the Waves, which is a film that's not credited as a dogma film in any sense, of course, but having drawn from the inspiration of some of the filmmaking techniques that Lars von Trier used. Who knows, maybe since it was such a collective, Lars said, I'll read and I'll do the press conference and you will do the first film.
And since you just mentioned Breaking the Waves, also Thomas Vinterberg had his debut feature in 1996, so after the dogma, but that was also not a dogma film yet. And so these four filmmakers, the first initial four, they are often referred to as the Brethren. They produced each one film. So we have the two, Van Trier and Vinterberg in 1998. Then we have Søren Krag Jacobsen with Mifune, I don't know how to pronounce that, which played at the Berlinale in 1999. And then we have Christian Levering, The King is Alive, that played also in Cannes in 2000. So within 2 years, more or less, these four dogma films that were really the founding fathers of the movement. And those four also came together in 2001 and made this film D-Day, which was quite an interesting experiment. I don't know if you read up on that, what that is?
No, I didn't get the chance.
It's really interesting. I mean, that's also part of this in-between cinema and TV, because Festen and other films by Vinterberg, they had sort of... there were some compromises made in order for these films to be granted financing. So Festen, for instance, that had to play after Cannes within 3 months or so, it had to play in Danish TV, which is also why so quickly around 20% of the Danish population saw that film. And this D-Day film in 2001 was a film that was shot on, I think it was the year of the millennium. On New Year's Eve, those four filmmakers just they shot scenes with the established actors that we will talk about later as well. And then they were all simultaneously played on different broadcasts on Danish television. And you could sort of edit your own film. So it basically promoted an active viewing in the sense that you had to some extent control over what you saw at the time. So they really tried to push the boundaries there to some extent.
No, it sounds very fascinating, because when I think of Dogma 95, I think, yes, there are rules, but yes, it's also a game, and it's playing a lot with control, playing with storytelling, of which, the Danish have such a history, just from Hans Christian Andersen to, I don't know, Dreyer and Bergman. Dreyer is Danish, Bergman is Swedish, but the Scandinavians in general, which I'm sorry to group you together if you are offended by this, but just very rich storytelling. Going back to the idea of it as a game and just really democratizing in some sense and making filmmaking perhaps something that can be fun in a different way and more accessible. So to hear you talking about that, the viewing experience is also one that could be manipulated and controlled.
Exactly, which is usually, this is theorized. This is one of the aspects where you can tell apart cinema and theater. So in the theater, there is this always the possibility that you could interfere in the action, right? But cinema in that sense is really passive. You have to take it as it is served or delivered to you. And there is not the reciprocity. There is no live moment there. There is no interaction between the audience and the actors, and there's no sense of that. So this sort of breaks with that to some extent, right? can interfere.
That's interesting, and I'd like to get back to it at another point.
I sort of appear democratic, but I'm not.
So maybe just before we really get into this, so now we have established some of the context of dogma overall. Maybe because it's still Cannesversations, we should talk about a bit about the Cannes that year. This was a Cannes festival where Theo Angelopoulos won for Eternity and a Day, and the jury president of that time was Martin Scorsese. A lot of interesting films played this year as well, a lot of memorable ones. Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, for instance, by Terry Gilliam. We have Ho Xiaoxian's Flower of Shanghai, Chai Min-liang's The Hole, Roberto Benigni's Life is Beautiful, and of course, as we mentioned already, The Idiots by Lars von Trier. Also interesting to see that there was no female filmmaker, which has changed to some extent. What did we have this year? Like 1/3 of filmmakers were female at Cannes. So it's still not great, but there has been some progress, and that you can see.
It's interesting too, because the jury was sprinkled with females. You have Chiara Maestriani, Lena Olin, Winona Ryder, Sigourney Weaver as well, and Cuban writer Zoe Valdez.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
it's about 50-50, I think.
Yeah, I guess it was rather... I don't know. I think with these juries, I think what people really look at is just the president. And all the other people, they do matter just as faces, but I do think it's always about the prestige of heading the jury. But in any case, and Eliana, could you tell us, there's this interesting story how this film just came to life at all. Like, how was Vinterberg inspired here? Because one has to say, this is not a story that was derived just, from his mind or from his great ideas. There's quite a fascinating story that is worth recounting here.
There's a quite charismatic, youngish Vinterberg on YouTube talking about how this story came to him. It came through a friend who had a radio program who advised him to make a film of this. And on that radio program, a young man who identified himself as Alan went on the show and said that he had stood up during a family celebration and announced that he was sexually molested by his father. Vinterberg took the essence of that story and he claims that he did not listen to it in its entirety because it's a very heavy story to listen to. He later made a film. And he talked with his lawyers, he talked with the people that he needed to in order to try to make sure that he would be able to secure not being sued, I suppose. And eventually the story continues and has many different layers. Vinterberg became quite famous for this film. He got a lot of attention for it. And then it became obvious to the man who actually hosted the radio show that this was a story on his show. It became obvious to other people. People would come up to Vinterberg and tell him, oh, I recognize this story. Eventually, the press started looking for this man, Alan, who had told the story, and they found him. And the story really just continues, and Alan had actually made up some parts. But Vinterberg tells it in a much better way.
This is a big story of appropriation, isn't it?
It is a big story of appropriation, which in all of its irony, whatever it means to get at the heart of truth through the Dogma 95 rules, the Dogma 95 manifesto. We can see from this, one, stripped of the story, the film in this telling of this story behind the film is stripped of its illusions. But that in itself is not the guiding principle that should have led the making of Festen. The story does continue and takes many different turns, but it's worth listening to. And I think one of the funniest things is rather the fact that one aspect of whatever illusion cinema provides and the idea of potentially stripping a story or a film of its dramaturgy, that there's an impossibility about that, which is very clear from at least the few Dogma films that we've seen. I don't know if you would agree.
Yeah, I think... Before I get into that, I just want to very quickly say that so this Alan guy basically took the story from someone else he encountered in the hospital. So this was an appropriation of that story. But with regard to what you just said, yeah, I think that's also really present in this documentary I mentioned earlier, in The Purified, where there's this debate about whether by stripping it down to sort of skeleton, we hide more the artifice of it, or if we get closer to the truth behind that. And I think that's really an ongoing discussion, right? Are you just hiding things more clearly, or are you preventing yourself from hiding behind a narrative and all the glamour that is usually associated with film sets and everything? Yeah, I think
one can talk forever about that.
Possibly, yeah. I think, but this is really one more thing about Festen compared to The Idiots, for instance, which, as I mentioned, played at the same Cannes Film Festival. Festen made quite a lot of money. I think it had a budget from 1.65 million and it made around 20. Compare that to The Idiots, of course, that is many ways a much less commercial film and probably much more challenging to audiences, but that really made just $7,000. And you can see that this was probably just, I don't know, like IFC or Lincoln Center or something, and they probably made all the money for that film. So it really set up a big movement, that film.
Mm-hmm. I mean, allegedly, The Idiots also was booed heavily, and I think a well-known film critic, Mark Kermode, was thrown out of the screening because he yelled in the screening "Il est merde," and then later admitted, "Oh, that's not proper French," even. And
yeah, I never understood that in Cannes. I think that's very disrespectful, and I wonder you have this upper class of people, like the supposed upper class of people, but then they have the worst manners in the world. So I never quite understood, like, why would you boo an artist who has put quite a lot of effort, quite some time, quite some work and blood and sweat into something? Why would you boo these people?
But it reinforces the fact that they were actually able to achieve something and get a reaction that they probably wanted.
It's true. There was no indifference, to be sure. So yeah, let's get to the meat, as we sometimes say here on the podcast. Let's go to the meat of the story. So we have Festen, Thomas Vinterberg's second film. Do you want to just maybe present us with the premise of the film, what happens there?
Sure. So there is a celebration for the 60th birthday of the patriarch Helge. He's well respected, well known in the community. And during the festivities, his eldest son, Christian,
the protagonist.
So this is actually very interesting. Sorry, to side note.
No.
But Vinterberg tells a lovely little anecdote on the first day of shooting. Ulrich Thomsen and
Henning Moritzen, who also was an actor in Ingmar Bergman's Cries and Whispers, for instance. So a well-established actor.
Mm-hmm. So on the first day of shooting, when both actors introduced themselves, Ulrich Thomsen, who plays Christian, said, "I am Ulrich Thomsen. I am playing the protagonist, Christian." And then Henning Moritzen said, "I'm Henning Moritzen. I'm also playing the protagonist, the father." And I think that says so much about this film.
Oh, that's interesting.
But yes, the eldest son stands up and he delivers a toast, which is not a toast, but like the radio show, he's revealing the transgressions of his father in the past.
That are?
Of sexual molestation of him and his twin sister. The family also is comprised of two other siblings, Michael, who's the youngest, and
Michael,
who's the youngest, and Helene, played by Paprika Steen, who's also credited for helping cast pretty much the majority of the film.
Michael, played by Thomas Bo Larsen, who is a frequent collaborator of Vinterberg. I mean, he even was in his Oscar-winning, I think, Drunk, right?
Yeah.
Another round that won the Oscars
and
in 2020.
And he was also featured in Vinterberg's student graduate film.
Exactly. And in the short films, I think in his debut film as well, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. All these actors you see pop up again and again throughout Thomas Vinterberg's career. Same is true for his mentor figure, right? From the Danish Film School. And this is maybe interesting for context, just that in the 90s, the Danish film landscape changed quite drastically. I think three of the major film institutions, I think the museum and the Danish Film School, and there was another institution that doesn't come to mind. They all merged together into one big institution, and that came with a lot of changes, and people got more and more concerned with just restoration of films and trying to develop manufacture even sort of new generation of writers and directors in that generation. And of that, I think we should say that Thomas Vinterberg was seen as a prodigy, really. That's also, if you just look at it and you see that how young Thomas Vinterberg was compared to Lars von Trier and all the others, it strikes you as, quite remarkable. And I think Lars von Trier saw a talent there very early, and this is also why he pushed him into the first row here. Mm-hmm. It's funny how they make almost like as if there was some
initiation, or
but also they joke about how there may have been a malicious intent of Lars von Trier to just see if this works out or not for him, and maybe to like ruin his reputation even before he started to started off his career, and then he failed and was so successful.
Yes, I believe Vinterberg was 28 when he made Festen.
Right. So that's like comparable to maybe Damien Chazelle, right, who very early with Whiplash, for instance, had his major shot. It's Orson Welles, of course. I mean, I don't want to compare them like qualitatively throughout their oeuvre, but for sure you can see like how early he really was with his film. Yeah, so, and that is quite an interesting setup we have there, right? With this entire family at this big hotel, which is sort of the family mansion. Mm-hmm. And we also have, next to the family who comes from different countries and so on, we also have, to quite a remarkable extent, we have the kitchen there as well, and the kitchen personnel who, especially with Christian, they share a long history, because Christian, I would still claim the protagonist, but of course I am sure Henning Moritzen might disagree here. Christian lives in Paris, and he is a successful restaurateur in Paris. He runs 2 restaurants, so he has this natural link to the chefs there because they know each other from childhood onwards. And it is known that these people in the kitchen also know about what happened in the past.
What's really sweet and on display here, I think, is a type of shared solidarity between the upstairs and the downstairs. Kim, who is the chef, he's unable to cook unless he's drunk. And there are different ways that the camera allows us in on some of the action and the presence of those who work for the hotel provide in pushing the story forward. In one particular scene, when the 2 protagonists, as we've already established, where they meet each other in the cellar of the hotel, and it becomes clear through the camera movements that they're being observed. But by whom? That's revealed a little bit later when we discover that the hotel personnel know, because they report back to Kim, the chef, what has transpired between Christian and his father, Helge.
Okay, so maybe, is there something that initially, because I think that's such an energetic film, right? It really radiates energy and it radiates dynamic. So is there something you can maybe tell us about your first viewing experience and why you picked that film in particular?
I think it was definitely because of the energy. I saw this film when I was maybe less than 10 years of age, which was probably too young, but at the same time, very different experience from many of the other media that I had consumed.
But that's funny, because in Denmark, this film has a rating that is 11 and above, whereas in the US, it has an R rating.
Oh my.
I think that's very funny.
That is very funny. That just speaks to so many cultural, just sensitivity differences. No, I just remember thinking, I suppose because I grew up in a small family, it was very lovely to see a whole entire family on display, and then to see the dynamics that they exchange with one another. Each sibling has a very strong personality. The whole entire plot that slowly unravels, and the way that it's done is very realistic in a way that's jarring. I mean, the idea of confessing something that you've held as perhaps your own shame or your own humiliation throughout your entire life to a group of people, and then for it to be met with, oh, let's just carry on and go to the next course of the meal. It had a big impact on me when I first saw it. And how about you?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, I watched it the first time with you together, and I just could not resist the energy I saw here. That was quite amazing and at times really overwhelming. But I have to say, this film overtly should be so sinister and so just grim, but it's actually such a joy. It's so funny. Even the way the camera moves, I mean, as we know from our vow that we presented at the beginning, it's all handheld camera. That means that sometimes you just have insane camera movements. You know, it's also the camera here serves sort of a narrative function. Like, there's this very funny scene when this ragey brother, what's his name again? Michael, yeah. When he complains to his wife or partner that she didn't pack his shoes, and how could he face his father, who has not even invited him. This takes place a few weeks or months after the funeral of the twin daughter, Linda, who was the twin of Christian, the protagonist. And so Michael, he didn't show up. So now he's not even invited to the festivity here. And then he complains about her not having packed his shoes. Then the camera moves down when he points at his socks, that he says, oh, I cannot face my father in socks. And the camera goes down and up again. And it's like, it's such an interactive ride, this film. It's always in movement.
Yeah, the frenetic activity, as you mentioned, plays a role both in, this is very comedic, the scene that you just mentioned, but also sometimes it predicts what might happen next, as if we too could be amongst the guests invited to this lovely hotel in the countryside of Denmark, I assume, and we're just watching and eating with them. There are also some other camera angles which take place, which have been interpreted and then look a little bit like surveillance camera footage, and they've been interpreted as potentially the haunting of the absence of the sister.
Yeah, and I think the first outlines of the script were much more supernatural that the script ended up being, and the realized film at the end. And I think Linda's presence was more and more decreased the more the shoot was going on and the more the editing got on. So there is a lot of footage that you can still see, where you can see Linda, but that was taken out of the film to, paradoxically, as Thomas Vinterberg claims, to enhance her presence in that film. And I think that's a lovely theorization here, that sometimes to really emphasize a presence, you have to reduce their presence.
It's funny that you bring this up about the absence and the presence of the sister, because one of the early working titles for Festen was Blood of the Bourgeoisie. It featured a poster of a ghost that was covered in blood, so one that's very different from the one we have now, and it would indeed have made a very different film.
And yeah, so I think what's also fascinating is, and we're greatly indebted here to C. Claire Thompson's book on the film, which also is not an everyday occurrence that an entire book is devoted to one film, right? But since this is so historical in many respects, this film, I think this deserves it. And you just learn also a lot about the Danish film landscape of the time. There it was suggested, and this goes back to a critic, that this family, the different members, they could be seen as a cartography of Denmark. So you have Helge, who pertains to the ruling class, the establishment. Then you have the mother, who's, I think probably a character not talked about too much, but this is very much in line with this reading here, because there it is suggested that she sort of represents the silent majority of Denmark, that if bad things occur, they just try to not bring it up again, not to create any tension, not to create any conflict. Then we have, of course, Christian, and he's the dissident, the expatriate, and he's sort of renouncing his citizenship. Whereas his brother Michael, now I'm doing the same thing, he represents the lower class, which is also pronounced through his Copenhagen sociolect.
Okay.
Exactly, yeah. And then Helene, and she's the sort of, I don't know if you can call her the intellectual that is suggested in the book, but at least she is the cosmopolitan, liberal sister who brings to the table a black person of color, right? And this also leads to some tension that is very funny, but also very disturbing in the film.
Yes. From what you've just said, I mean, all I think of is really this Shakespeare line from Hamlet, something is rotten in the state of Denmark. Yet at the same time,
that's good.
I see some aspects of Hamlet and some aspects of Macbeth, even though that takes place in Scotland. But I see the mother character who is almost like a toned down Lady Macbeth. She is potentially equally guilty of something. Yet it is Christian who spends the time sort of washing his hands or making this gesture as if he too is trying to get something out. But back to the racist aspect of this film. Yes, there was something very interesting in this book that talked about Festen also being, as you said, perhaps like a sociological view of Denmark. And one particular scene, well, it builds up very well, like the idea of aggression, retaliation. First, we see it when Bartokai, who is Helen's boyfriend, arrives, driven in a taxi by, of course, Thomas Vinterberg, who makes a little cameo in his own film, which was his way of getting credited by finding that loophole, because in the rules, the director is not to be credited. He arrives and Michael greets him. Greet is really a mild way to put it.
I think he says Charlie Brown.
Yes. And he says, oh, you're at the wrong place. And it's not until Helen comes and rescues Bartokai that Michael understands and is not pleased with the fact that he's still there. And this tension rises throughout the film.
And I must say, he's just so good, right?
He's
the
really
actor,
good.
Thomas Bo-Larsen, because I just believe that, I just believe that he's a racist pig. His energy is unmatched in this film.
And so this racist aspect comes to a climax at the dinner table, following perhaps the first toast of Christian, where Michael's character, who's already had a little bit of a fumble with Bartokai's character, encourages all the guests to sing a racist Danish song, and everyone joins in. Now, a lot has been said about the fact that the extras in this film were not warned as to what Christian's toast would be, in where he condemns his father's... Well, he doesn't really condemn his father's behavior. He rather just announces his father's behavior. And thus, some people have just said, is it possible that the singing of the racist Danish song was scripted? Or is it something that naturally happened? One can't know, but there is an involvement on the part of the viewer, which this book by C. Claire Thompson highlights, that perhaps if one is a Danish person at the time watching on their TV, because that is how it was broadcasted, they might have found themselves inclined to sing along or to just recognize this tune, which says quite a lot about.
Yeah, and I think that's such a fascinating aspect. I think there's this discussion often whether intention matters when it comes to racism, right? Like there is, of course, an objective racist action and there is not. But this really makes you question whether there is a racist intent with these people, or if it just... Sometimes those dynamics, those social dynamics, they just... I don't know, they are spurred or initiated through certain rhythms or a melody, and then you think back and hear a song and you don't even realize cognitively that this is actually, quite disturbing text. And I think the way you are brought up, you just sometimes overlook these things, right? And then only if you maybe pointed at that, or if people point at that and then make you reflect on that. And I wonder if that is at play here at all, but I think the film leaves that open. And
it definitely leaves it open. I think in another scene with the mother figure, this whole entire idea of intention or something that is so subtle that we cannot accuse this action perhaps of being a racist one or an intentionally racist one comes up. But upon meeting Batakai, the mother with Hélène present essentially says, "Oh, welcome back." And Hélène responds, "No, that was another one, Mom." And
it's so, I had to laugh so hard. I think it's very funny.
And she says this in Danish, so Batakai presumably doesn't understand either. And then the mother just says, "Oh, welcome, Kai."
Yeah.
Which is not his real name or the name that he's introduced himself as.
Yeah, and
it's a Danish name or nickname that I suppose she's more comfortable saying.
And later there's even like Spanish name or something about it, right?
Yes, I think
that he's called.
Yes.
And speaking of the mother still, I think it's, of her being the like silent majority, there is this pivotal scene when Christian for the first time. And this also, okay, maybe I should go back here first, because before he reads out his speech, he holds two envelopes to his father, a red one and a green, like a green one and a yellow one.
Yellow one and a green one.
Yeah. And he asks his father which one he picks. And it's even, so the father, I think, decides to choose the green one. And there you can even argue this is sort of an unconscious blue or red pill, from the Matrix,
Yes.
in the sense of, do you want to know the truth? Do you want to reveal the truth or not? And of course, this predates Matrix. So in a sense, I think that's interesting. And the father, of course, cannot know what is behind that. But in any case, so Christian, did you want to say something to that?
Or even whether anything is behind that, because I think that is also some strange psychological trap to offer two potentials and then basically there is no potential. That was his intention the entire time. Of course, I don't know whether there was even...
Yeah, and I think I read in an interview that even Thomas Vinterberg, he said he doesn't know what was in the other envelope. Yeah, so in any case, so Christian reads his letter to all the family. It's a huge extended family, so there are also Germans and people from all over Europe. And then the mother's reaction to that is basically that she refers to his childhood when he would play with
his imaginary friend, Snoot or something.
So she would just try to put all his accusations into question and sort of discredit him and making him not a reliable source of any sort of information, which is quite, like that is not so much commented about, I think, when you talk about this film, the mother.
No, I think the mother character is very interesting to look at because I don't mean to skip ahead, but at the end, she's the one who's allowed to stay. The patriarch somehow gets chased away in a very toned down way, but he's asked to leave and he willfully dismisses himself. But the mother, as if she also is against Helge, just sits and is allowed to eat the brunch. Maybe we should go back because we have a little bit of a gap to fill in plot-wise. So, going back to the story of Alan, it's quite interesting. Vinterberg says that he had stopped listening to Alan's version of the story, but according to this version, after the announcement, after the first toast was made by the son, all the guests left. So in his film, Vinterberg uses a trick, a little plot device in order to keep everyone at the hotel. He gets all the workers from downstairs who work in the kitchen or who are just the service personnel in general for the hotel, and they hide all the guests' car keys.
Yeah, it's true. Maybe one of the other pivotal scenes of this film is perhaps this parallel montage scene, right? When they are in bathrooms and the focus lies here on the water as a theme because it was in a bathtub, I think, where the twin sister / daughter committed suicide. And in the bathroom is here the overall connecting place of the past and the present.
Yeah, this is a bit of an inside joke, but you can always tell an art house film because I always joke that it starts or ends with water, or there's always some water that's
true.
involved. Who knows? Is it the womb? Is it just the call of nature? Is it just the flow? Something about water that's both tangible and intangible, escapes, flows,
Many films
and connects.
Yeah, and many films also ending on the beach, right? Or at the beach.
And this parallel that's linked through water, I think really enforces whatever connection that these siblings do have with one another. Even though they live completely different lives, we get the sense, oh, perhaps, I mean, maybe it is in this sense, came from the same source.
Yeah, and there is some trickery here when it comes to the Dogma manifesto, because there are these parallel shots and there's almost a reaction that occurs when, I think, the letter is found, right? Or is it when the letter is found, or when Michael slips down, or when Pia, who is another female character here who is important for Christian,
she works at the hotel.
Yeah. And I think when she takes a bath, and she then evokes Linda there in her dying, in a sense. Yeah. And between these scenes that are occurring at the same time, it's as if they are reacting to each other, even though, of course, they are in different rooms. And this is part of the Dogma thing, that they cannot be at different locations at the same time. So this is interesting.
You mean as to say whether they're breaking the rules, or do you mean as to
No, they
say
found a
just,
way, I think. They found a way to circumvent the rule, or like stretch the rules here and also to make that thematic link of water, right?
Yeah.
And how the children are interconnected.
Yes, I'd have to say that my first understanding of Dogma 95 rules was also a bit maybe blurred, and it was only after watching the documentary and seeing some behind the scenes. They had 3 cameras on set and they had boom operators, but perhaps the idea that, what is it specifically? The rule is that no manipulation of the image should happen, and the sound of the image should be synced.
Exactly.
So I believe that is the primary rule that is adhered to, but manipulation of the image, I suppose, if you believe that editing or trimming or cutting different sequences together is manipulation of the image, then arguably they have done something wrong. But I believe we can get more into that too, whether a Dogma film is a Dogma film according to the rules.
Yeah, and perhaps also to link that thematically, this is one of the themes of the film itself, which is, the breaching of rules or sticking to rules. I think there is, the film starts very early with Michael arriving at the hotel, and he's told that he is not invited and he cannot stay. It's, there we are already familiarized with the rules, and the rules, they are made by the patriarch. And later it's interesting, it's not really what Christian is saying that makes him explode at the end, Helge. It's when he's asking for his wine or water to be filled up and no one reacts to that, that is when he freaks out. And I think that's notable, right? Like a film that is so formally, but also thematically, so much concerned with rules and adhering to them. It's interesting that this is also the moment where he loses finally control, where you would have thought, oh, he would have lost control already, like 20 minutes ago.
Yeah, because I think also it's really brilliant, because the idea of loss of control comes, I suppose, not when someone who you've been belittling and humiliating sexually your entire life is angry at you or is accusing you of things, but it's when the people around you suddenly stop responding to you and stop obeying the natural order.
Right. Are there other themes or noteworthy aspects that you want to point out with regard to that film? I think there's a lot, but at the same time, I think it's also a very visceral experience, right? It's very dynamic. It has a lot of humor, which is one of the most subjective things about cinema, right? Humor.
This is very interesting, because I have read some things that said that in America initially, people viewed this and categorized it under black comedy. And Vinterberg was actually very opposed to this idea. He doesn't like the idea that Festen is seen as a black comedy. But
to him, it was rather a drama? Or?
To him, I think it is rather a drama,
I see.
though there are funny elements. And he says that the American reception of it is people would laugh the entire time through, perhaps out of awkwardness, perhaps out of just, I don't know, really. But then in Denmark, the reception primarily was they would laugh the first half, and then the second half they'd leave and say that they were very moved by the film.
Mm-hmm.
Which also points to another, I suppose, cultural difference. Thematically, there's so much to talk about. I mean, I do think this film is a visceral one, and it's hard for anyone who's listening, if they haven't seen the film, for us to just tear it apart like this, because for me, there are many aspects of how trauma is treated in this film that I wouldn't say appeal to me, but it's done in such a way that I think many films fail at doing. Which is, this is never about Christian getting a specific type of revenge, nor is it about him telling a story and breaking down. It's just about him vocalizing something. There was a very big, in the process, Ulrich Thomsen did a lot of research on victims of incest and had a big argument in ways with Thomas Vinterberg about how he should perform the monologue where he announces what his father did to him. And Vinterberg wanted him to do it in high spirits, as if this is a man who's getting revenge. And Ulrich Thomsen thought that he should do it sort of down, sad, depressed, it's a heavy topic. But later abided by what it was that Vinterberg wanted. How did you find the dream sequence? Because it's highly implied too, in this, that Christian and Linda, the deceased sister, had also improper sexual contact, and that Christian might even be to blame for the death of Linda. And Helga knows this, and Helga leverages that over Christian. And this really drives the plot forward, to be honest, when Helga accuses Christian of having issues, of being someone who was dysfunctional, who had had his body pumped full of medication, etc., and just not been there, not been able to pick up the call of his sister, who he claimed to always be there for. And Christian has doubts because, well, he's never received some form of letter, which Helga knows very well, that there is no suicide note. And this drives the plot forward because a suicide note is discovered.
And even that very much in the style of handheld camera and in the style of dynamic filmmaking, right?
Yes, in the cheeky way that there is a mixture of realism and illusion in how there's a little bit of a treasure hunt that's orchestrated during the parallel water scenes where the middle sister, Helene, the only sister, looks for some clues, and they play a kind of hot-cold game that they used to play, but that she plays with the receptionist.
Yeah, and so interestingly, there are these arrows painted on the wall, and when this scene was shot, the actors were not told where these arrows were, so there's even this sort of improvisational notion present in this scene that the actors themselves had to find the clues.
Oh, how did you find the dream sequence?
Yeah. So back to the dream sequence. It's also one of these scenes where they swing for the fences to be within the limits of the dogma.
It's true.
Set of rules, right? Because I think the argument that is made in this book by C. Claire Thompson is that due to, I think, is it the ticking clock or something or is it the ringing phone? Yeah, right. The telephone. Mm-hmm. So we hear this as still, pertaining to what we conceive of as reality, while Christian imagines his sister Linda in his dreams. And the sister also weirdly merges with this woman, Pia, who is sort of the closest, it seems, to what could be a partner for him. And in many instances, Christian is referred to as impotent in the reception of this film. And it is even here, I mean, for a reason, right? Because we see how Pia is trying to initiate contact with him and he's not really receptive to that. But so Pia merges with Linda, which, at the end, it is Christian who asks Pia if she wants to go to Paris with him, to go back, and she agrees immediately. So what does it tell us that Pia merges with Linda so supposedly the woman that in his dream resembles the dead sister with whom he had allegedly incestuous contact.
I thought it was very beautiful, the way that the dream sequence was done, because we have Christian who believes potentially, you know, that his sister was the greatest love in some sense. There's a very strong connection. There's no other word, I guess, than connection that they must have shared, being the victims to their father's behavior. And in the similar way that we talked in the previous episode, that Bob Fosse is seduced by a woman into the afterlife, to me this was also the appearance of the dead sister. It was almost as if she was also trying to seduce Christian into the afterlife. And Christian says, no. He says, is it time? And Linda says, no, it's not time. And then we start to hear the telephone, and then we start to see reality again. And right next to him is Pia, fallen asleep, fully clothed on the bed. And this was, I don't know, it's just that got me, because the idea of the impossible meetings always get me, and just what it is that he might actually desire, and that being impossible and out of reach.
Yeah, and in keeping with the dogma rules, so this ringing of the telephone that sort of binds him to the reality, and even temporality, it doesn't matter so much, because we all know these instances when we dream something, but our dream is affected by our surroundings, be it something like temperature or sound or something, or even smell, right? So sometimes you smell something in your dream. This is very, very mundane. It's just what you actually are perceiving in that moment.
Yeah. And just working on the theme of family, I mean, who's on the telephone? It's Helen, basically saying Michael can't be found, Michael has gone missing. So I love that little bit of, okay, the sister who is dead is left in the unconscious, is left in the afterworld, but there still are other siblings who need his presence as well.
Are there other things you would still like to discuss?
I think this is a film that one should see in their life. I was very happy to get to see it again, and to see it on quite a few different occasions, because there's something raw and frenetic, energetic, yet somewhat cathartic for me. I think there's something that's not too far from mythology or just classic literature. You can interpret it with Freudian psychoanalysis as well, I suppose. And just in terms of getting energized by the whole entire movement, that in itself is another thing which keeps giving.
Yeah, and this really evokes this first sentence of Anna Karenina, right? Where it says every family is sad in their own way or something. And you also, I mean, you're in very good company here. Ingmar Bergman, upon seeing this, he called this one of the best films he's seen. And last week with Fosse, we had... Was it Kubrick saying that this is one of his best films or something? And now we have another grand figure of cinema, Ingmar Bergman, still good and well at the time, saying this one of the best films he's seen. Yeah, and Festen had such a huge influence on cinema, but also on the broader landscape of audio-visual media. So there was a stage adaptation that started out in Germany, then took over Europe, and even made it to Broadway as the first Danish play ever there, as far as people can say. And also something some people might not be aware of, because why would they? It's such a small thing. But in Germany, you could still see the influence there as well. There is this filmmaker called Jakob Lass, who helped Franz Rogowski to prominence, because in his first two films, Franz Rogowski had his first film roles. And this Jakob Lass, he was part of the Folkema movement in Germany. It stands for Fuck Dogma.
Oh my goodness.
Which seems very silly, because if you read that manifesto, it basically reads very similar to Dogma, and I wonder, it doesn't seem to be so removed from its original inspiration. But anyway, so you can see even around 15 years later or so, it still drove people to like think about that. And in 2010, which is something I only found out recently, there was a sequel to Festen. They played at the Vienna Burgtheater. It was a very prestigious theater in Austria. And there...
Written by Vinterberg.
Written and I think directed by Vinterberg. He said often when he was interviewed about that, I think he was about turning 40 or so, and he said Denmark is not really a landscape for artists. You know, they always think too small for him. They always think about their daily routines and everything, and that is something that he could not really identify with. And he said in order to juvenile himself and in order to make him still think and not get into these routines of, you know, creating, he had to do something new. So that was the first time, I think, that he was at the big stage, directing and writing for the big stage. So this was a sequel to Festen.
Oh my, what happens?
Yeah, this is quite fascinating. I mean, if I ask, you know, what would you think would happen in a Festen sequel? Because when I read that first, before I knew the premise, I thought, okay, what could you do? Like it seems
oh my goodness,
so much like an endpoint to the story.
Well, I'd say family is an institution, right? So we still have the family going strong, but maybe superficially strong. I don't know if there'd be generational. Oh, I think, okay, so... I see a funeral.
Very good. It's called The Funeral.
Okay. And it must be probably the funeral of this protagonist, Helge.
Oh, yeah? Very good.
But that's all I can possibly say, because I feel this is very much in line with just... the reality of mundane traumas of life, just simply not, you know, even if someone in your family is the horrible person, once they're gone, it's very difficult to cope with that. So I can see a theater piece being made with the 3 children who are still remaining and the wife perhaps trying to manage how navigate that.
And here you can see script writing is not difficult at all. Everyone can do it. You just did it live here on the record. And yeah, it's true, that happens. And the family comes together apparently for the first time since the events of the film for the funeral of Helge. And the big twist here is that Christian reveals that he abused the son of his brother, Michael. So, and this is sort of a story about the circle, you know, like a vicious circle, or like harm begets harm and pain begets pain.
Sin begets sin.
Yeah, exactly. So this, I think it's somewhat brave, right? Because if we think of Christian, we think of him primarily as a victim. At least I would think so.
I do think it's somewhat brave, and I think it's very much in line with Lars von Trier and Thomas Vinterberg finding ways still to provoke. Because on the one hand, this plot that you just explained to me is one that is predictable, but also one that mainstream audiences do and don't want to see, or maybe do and don't want to admit. I think there is also an argument to be made that incest and sexual abuse have become somewhat mainstream topics. I don't really want to talk about that, even though I just brought it up. But what is there that can still shock? And how can we then turn these stories or give it the proper platform to discuss that type? And I think it must be done in some art form.
Maybe just to wrap this up here, we should just see this film in context of Thomas Vinterberg's overall filmography. I think the one name we weirdly haven't mentioned, even though he's so important to his filmmaking, is Mogens Rukov, who was an early mentor of his at film school, and later on I think they co-wrote the first 3 films together. Rukov, a big institution in Denmark, helped a lot of aspiring filmmakers to create their first films. He was a consultant for Lars von Trier's first film, The Element of Crime, in 1984, quite early. And with him, he wrote the next film as well. It's called It's All About Love. This is so strange, right? But then again, maybe it's not so strange. Following 5 years after Festen, And what happened and would happen again and again with Thomas Vinterberg's career is that this would be measured against the Festen aesthetics, the Festen success. People would see it and compare it inevitably to Festen and see that it was not Festen. But a quite remarkable cast, one has to say. English language as well, meaning that Vinterberg clearly wanted to go for something else here, starring Joaquin Phoenix, Claire Danes, Sean Penn, and
I believe Vinterberg also is quite fond of this film.
right.
I haven't seen it yet, but it was not well received.
Certainly not. And his next one wasn't either. It's called Dear Wendy, written by Lars von Trier and set in West Virginia. I think it's, in a way, a film that seems very logical from a European standpoint because it's about gun violence in the United States. And it's called Dear Wendy, and I think Wendy is the gun in that film. Yeah, but I would really like to see that at some point too. I think the next big success for him was Submarino in 2010. So one can see, there was 12 years till his next acclaimed film critically that played at the Berlinale.
And in 2012, he directed The Hunt, which actually was well received.
Yeah, that's interesting in the sense that this was also inspired by a story he was...
It's true that but you'd have to...
he said he knows people where children... The basic promise of The Hunt is that there's a kindergarten teacher who is accused of molesting his children in the kindergarten. And this is very early made clear this is not the case. So it's a story about a witch hunt, and he says that he has heard about these things in his own friend circle, whether friends or not. So it's interesting how he sometimes takes these stories and then makes it his films.
It almost sounds like the inverse to Festen in some sense. Right. But that's true. He also did, was it in 2003, 4, 5? Far from the Madding Crowd.
Yeah.
An adaptation of Thomas Hardy novel of the same name, starring Carey Mulligan and Michael Sheen.
Yeah, I think that was also part of maybe trying to build an international profile, I suppose, right? I mean, all these English language films afterward, it is remarkable. Yeah, and of course, dear listener, look at this poster for Kursk. It's a film from 2018 based on true events. It's about a submarine disaster, and I mean, it has quite a remarkable cast among them, the essay too. But just look at this poster, and I think you have an idea what this film is. I have not seen that film, but if I see this poster, I feel like I've seen that film already. It looks absolutely terrible, and I don't know how in 2018 I'm just talking about the poster here, okay? But how such a poster could still be created. But in any case, then came COVID in 2020, and that meant that Cannes, for the first time since the 1960s, was cancelled. There was a small list of Cannes films that was released digitally with the Cannes logo, so they could technically be considered Cannes films. And that is where another round came about. And I remember that so well because back at the time, it was such an uncertain time where no one knew, is it safe to go to the theaters? Many people said it was because of the air conditioning there and how the air circulation, but many people were afraid to go to the cinema. That's also why Christopher Nolan's Tenet, that was part of the reason why that film rather bombed at the box office. But this another round, there was literally, I remember there was in the theater for the entire year because there were no movies at the time. And this ended up winning Vinterberg his first Oscar as Best Foreign Language Film. I think he was also nominated for Best Director for that film. Yeah, in any case.
And César as well for the film, or was that for another film?
It's highly possible. I was not a fan at all of that film. I think Mads Mikkelsen teaming up with him again after The Hunt, that is all nice and well. But this film, I don't know. I didn't see the point, really. But of course, it has this final scene that is, I think, memed a lot on the internet, where Mads is just dancing around, having fun
I didn't see the film, but I know the final scene. And I know the song.
And I think a lot of people have had this experience. But in any case, it still seems, because I didn't find any contradictory sources on the internet, that they are still working on US remake starring Leonardo DiCaprio as Mads Mikkelsen.
This is interesting because now I feel like we've gone from hypocrisy at Cannes to potentially internal, not hypocrisy, that's a bit rough to say.
That's just Hollywood.
It's interesting to see some of these directors working in television.
Right. And
even though some of their emerging work was also in television as well.
Yeah, like Lars von Trier,
Yes.
right? And we have the same now with Thomas Vinterberg, who this year he's going to release his first TV series. It's a mini-series called Families Like Ours. We can look forward to that, I guess. Yeah, and I suppose this is where we end, right?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much where we end. There's a wealth of information on Dogma 95, and Thomas Vinterberg is always very enthusiastic to talk about Festen, because I think it was, in some sense, a highlight of his career, and there's a lot online to look at if you want to, and there's even a Criterion commentary that he personally did 10 years following the filming of Festen. And finally, in that spirit, I thought it'd be a little fun to mention something else that happened in 1995 on the 100th anniversary of cinema, or the birthday of the first footage that the Lumiere brothers shot, which was on March 19th, 1895, which iconically featured a group of factory workers exiting the Lumiere factory in Lyon. There are three versions, jokingly referred to as the one with one horse, the one with two horses, and the one with no horses. And this footage was then screened 3 days later on March 22nd, privately for the first time, because the box that they used, which is called a cinématographe, functioned as a camera and as a projector. And the reason why the Lumiere brothers are so well known is because they invented a technology that allowed to feed the film more effectively through, using a method that's quite similar to the way that a sewing machine works. So, flash forward 100 years, and the French producer and filmmaker Anne Andreu invited around 40 international filmmakers to make a film using the Lumiere brothers' original setup with the cinematograph and the hand-cranked box in order that would circulate the film stock. And so filmmakers from David Lynch, Abbas Kiarostami, Michael Haneke, Zhang Yimou, Spike Lee, Wim Wenders, James Ivory, etc. were invited to make a short film with three constraints, or three rules. One, that it be no longer than 52 seconds. Two, that there be no synchronized sound. And three, that they would take no more than 3 takes. It's a very cute activity, but also somewhat rather different from the outlandish and revolutionary dogma rules. One that returns to the basics and the real physicality of film and the frustration that goes with developing film, and the origin, rather. And the other that throws you into the digital world and reignites for anyone out there who's an aspiring filmmaker or just a DIY attitude towards what is it that we are actually getting to. Perhaps one can embody the spirit of Dogma 95 or create Fogme or other versions of manifestos, because sometimes there's a loveliness, which also seems to be a recurring theme, of just an imposed restriction or a game that turns into a challenge. That might be something that turns into something else.
Yeah, but now you sort of provoke me to ask, is that sad to you? Like, you just basically said that this is his peak, and I think it's probably true, and he even acknowledged that himself to some extent. He said it was a blessing, but even more so a curse for his career, that this high acclaim came so early, and then he never quite found a way to match that later. And is that sad to you? Is that Because that's not how you would
I think
want your career trajectory to...
I think I have mixed feelings about that. I think there are many filmmakers that I've heard of, and I cannot name them right now, but who just have a very complex, as I suppose everyone in the world just might, complex relationship with the idea of success. Artists have a complex relationship with the idea of success. I know there's one filmmaker who I will not be able to name, who I've heard basically them say through another person who told me that they had reached the peak very early and they felt nothing. Is that it? And then they felt that they could have been chasing it until they were 80 or 90, and then only to realize that once you sort of achieve whatever success it is that you are supposed to achieve in your life, it might not give you the thing that you wanted. So I suppose it's all subjective, and each person has their own idea of what success means to them. I think it's very complicated. I don't think it's necessarily sad, but perhaps the blessing in it is to realize or to try to stay more grounded, if one can. Whether they achieve success early and young, a little bit later, or a sprinkle of success here and there, or how it is that they interpret their success. I don't know. That's how
very diplomatic answer, but I'll take it as such. And before I reveal what the next film is that we're going to see,
I am on the tip of my seat.
In keeping with our tradition here, just as a reminder that every time we record this, the other person is to choose the next film. And this always comes as a surprise live on the record here. But before I do that, I just want to announce that we will switch to bi-weekly podcasts just because...
Twice a week?
Bi-weekly every other week. That is what I mean here. I know that can lead to confusion. Just because it's very research heavy, we try to pack it as much as we can with information. And I hope you can appreciate that. So the film I pick for our next episode is going to be Valeska Grisebach's Festen. I don't know, have you heard of that film?
No, I haven't heard of that film.
Okay, so that's all the greater.
Say it again.
Valeska Grisebach. Festen is really fitting here. It's a European Western. It's set in Eastern Europe. It's about the divided Europe. It's taking the genre but making something new. It's also a bit like it has these post-colonialist implications that I will be happy to kind of decipher with you and maybe make something out of that. I think that's a film that has a lot to offer.
All right.
Yeah, so we'll leave it at that. And I want to thank you for doing this with me still.
Thank you for doing it with me too, Patrick.
Yeah, so as you see, we still haven't lost motivation, and I think we keep rolling.
We will keep rolling.
So see you then.
Ciao.